Hello, everyone. This is our second edition of the newsletter. And today my guest is going to be Nick Bloom. He's the William Eberly Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program at the NBR. He works on management practices and uncertainty, and most recently, he has this agenda working from home, which is what we are going to discuss today. He worked previously at the UK Treasury and McKinsey & Company. So he has had a fantastic and successful career. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a recipient of the Sloan Fellowship, the Bernasser Prize, the Frisch Medal, and a National Science Foundation Career Award. He graduated with a BA from Cambridge, a Master from Oxford, and a PhD from UCL. So welcome, Nick Bloom. Very nice to have you here. Sorry for the long introduction.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and on the remote edition, talking about working from home, I am actually working from home. It's like,
Me too.
this is like a weird dormitory I'm in. It's like our spare room is full of adult and kids' beds. So
I have all the laundry behind that you cannot see out of this square. So I'm in the same situation. So that opens to our discussion. So before the pandemic, less than 8% of people were able to work from home, and firms really didn't like it because they thought, people would not be productive, or they would shirk, or they would not communicate well. Sometimes we didn't even have the technology to do it. But kind of one way or another, the pandemic forced us to adapt to this and work from home. So my first question is, do you think that after the pandemic is over, we are going to keep working from home? Is this something that is here to stay? Or we are going to go back to status quo from before?
Great. Why don't I, absolutely. So why don't I quickly, I'm going to share 2 slides to answer this. So maybe that's easy. So I'll share screen now.
Okay.
Let's hope. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, I can see it.
So this is actually, I had 5 slides. I gave this presentation to a group of executives. Actually, this is very, very low tech, but it does the job perfectly. So I'm going to talk about just the first trend, which is working from home over time. But I've been working with Jose Barrera and Steve Davis on this survey of 2,500 working age adults per month. With the Atlanta Fed in Chicago, we've also been surveying a lot of US firms, in fact, a bunch of UK firms as well. And we're using a lot of other data. So I wanted to show you the first trend, which is exactly on your question. So here's from the survey of Jose and Steve. We've been asking 2,500. In fact, in the most recent few months, it's moved up to 5,000 people a month. We're using an online internet survey, which, for researchers is kind of an interesting side issue. I only got into this because one of my PhD students, Jack Blundell, about a year ago started doing this. And I'd heard about it from another academic, Evan Starr at Maryland, and always pondered about this. It's this thing whereby you pay people, basically, you go to a firm like Inquiry or Question Pro or Prolific, you pay typically $2 per response, and you get a panel of respondees, and it's very fast, very easy. There's a lot of concern about responsiveness, and I could talk about.
Who is spending time answering all these surveys?
You're exactly right. So, on observables, we reweight the current population survey. In fact, even unweighted looks quite similar to the US population. It's kind of quite odd. You'd wonder who the high income people in particular filling this out. When you ask them, one of the questions we had in 1 month, and Evan started on a bunch of the stuff, you ask them why they do it. Partly is interest, partly money. There are other questions people have been doing, like there's the Dallas Fed with Alex Blick and others have looked at replicating the CPS, and it actually does a pretty good job. The other thing in their defense is that's what was used for the 2020 polling. So initially you think 2020 was like a terrible disaster. The polling was awful. It wasn't, he's discussed how bad and good it was, but if you, for example, just to plot predicted Trump share versus actual on a county by county basis, it's very good. So So
it's as good as we can get, probably.
Yeah, people used to do what's called random digit dial or stopping people on the street, but both of those are more problematic now. So like,
yeah, now people don't walk and nobody answers the phone anymore. So
yeah, so for academics, I don't want to claim it's perfect by any means. This is far from perfect. You're exactly right. I mean, it's basically overweight on people, even based on observables that like to use the internet. So
but do you tell them what these asked questions are for? So do you know that they are replying for a study on this topic by these people? So do they get all the information? Respondents.
That's a good question. I mean, we start off, we just ask them, you start off with the basic questions, age, gender, and then we start asking, are you working? How many days a week? Where are you working? How much is working from home? How efficient? It's just a whole battery of questions. And they get $2. It should take them about 8 minutes. So I kind of raise it as it's a useful research tool. You can literally code the thing. Having done this, you want to pilot a lot. So the first 5 or 6 iterations, you just made mistakes. I mean, I coded it up myself. It's in Qualtrics. It's not very difficult to do. So you put the thing in and you discover, I mean, there's little things like you can imagine, right? Whenever you code these things up, you make errors and the answers come back. So I did like 5 or 6 in a row where I did 10
But because of the way you ask the questions, or just like bugs in the code?
Early on, it's bugs. You just make mistakes. There are other things, like I was doing something in the UK and I was porting it over to the US and I forgot to change the word postcode to zip code. That's just,
Some people have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, interesting enough, Prolific, which is one of the people that do that, there's a little message option. And I now always read the messages because they're full of all kinds of interesting comments and people give feedback. And then there are more subtle versions, like you do A/B testing. So we tested out asking how many days you work from home, and how many days are you going to work from home post-pandemic, and a different question, how many days you could commute to the workplace. So you should think they should give you the same answer. They don't exactly, because of differences in interpretation. And you also have to deal with things like self-employed people.
Or people that don't commute often. So, right?
Yeah.
People that commute only a few days, not all the days. There are all sorts of deals, even pre-pandemic.
Exactly right. So I'm going to, push to the side. I raised it for academics out there that it's actually really quite a cool tool, and I've been using it. It's fast, cheap, and pretty efficient. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's worth thinking about. If you want to collect a lot of data very fast, it's a good way to do it. So anyway, what do we actually find? Coming back to the results, here is, if you look, this is the y-axis is the percentage of full paid days that are work from home. So I get that, everyone works from home in the mornings and evenings and weekends. We basically, since we want to think about office space and commuting, it's the full day and it has to be paid. Before COVID, it's taken from the 2017-2018 American Time Use Survey. It's a fantastic survey, 10,000 wage and salaried Americans. That number's 5%. So there are different ways to break it down. Just before I move on, you can also ask people, as they do, how many people ever work from home a full paid day, even if it's once every 3 or 4 months, and that's 15%. But most people so 85% of people before the pandemic never worked from home ever. 15% did. Of that 15%, 2%, so a small share, did it full time. The other 13% were anything from 1 to 4 days a week.
Do you know what type of jobs were there, those 2%?
Yes. So again, working from home pre and during, and also post-pandemic, is hugely correlated with education. So they're highly likely to be graduate jobs. A lot of them, much from anecdote, I know were people that moved location. So I actually know 3 or 4 people pre-pandemic that worked entirely from home. So, for example, Petra Moser, who moved from Stanford to NYU, her husband worked, I believe it was in Cisco, for several years. Then they moved to New York, and I think he was primarily working from home. And I have several friends like that. So they moved in kind of high-level grad jobs, and they keep working for the same employer. There are also firms. There's a friend of mine, Christy Johnson. She's ex-McKinsey. She runs a management consulting firm that is called Artemis Consulting, that is entirely work from home. They recruit people from the get-go.
I see, to do it from home, yes.
But that's really rare.
It's very rare.
Partly it's intriguing talking. So before pandemic, it's very easy to get signed. Before pandemic, 5% of the days were working from home. Pretty rare, pretty small deal. During the pandemic, at the height of the first lockdown, you can see it went over 60%. That's partly because a lot of people lost their jobs. And of those that were left, the majority working from home. So working from home has been quite astoundingly a huge, you think of what's it called, forgotten the word for it, like non-pharmaceutical defenses.
Interventions.
That's it, is a huge issue. if we couldn't work from home, you'd have been stuffed with, the choice between going to the workplace and get potentially infected or just not work. But anyway, throughout the pandemic, including now, this is March data. It's not that, it's pretty recent. We're running April, it's in the field currently. About 50% of Americans are working from home. And this is full time. So it's 50% of working days. So, and then post-pandemic, it drops down to around 20%. We asked people, what has your employer told you? We also had the separate firm level survey.
Wait, sorry, I'll interrupt you here. So post-pandemic, you mean when you think the pandemic is over, or like what's the horizon? Yeah, we are not in post-pandemic yet, so.
You're exactly right. So we asked them post-pandemic in 2022 plus, how many days a week has your employer indicated you will be working from home? And if they say don't know, as in my employer hasn't told me, we give them a 0. Now I know that's a bit conservative, but I think that's probably correct at this point in time. Just to give you some confidence, that 20% number, we separately asked around 1,000 firms for this Atlanta, Fed, Chicago, Stanford survey, this thing called the Survey of Business Uncertainty, of firms, how many, for your employees, and we get a very similar 20% number. So I think it's about right. And the way to think about it, it's quite interesting. There's an extensive and an intensive margin adjustment. So during the pandemic, 50% of people roughly are working from home and they're doing it full time. So me, you, probably honestly, almost everyone listening to this, because they're still going to be grads, post-grads, are going to be working from home full time. Post-pandemic, that same 50% is going to make an adjustment on the intensive margin to going from 5 days a week on average to 2. So, and the other 50% never did, never is, and never will basically work from home. And you can imagine they're like people working in frontline retail, manufacturing,
healthcare, yeah. Although now we have telehealth, so even that is not obvious, right? So because
no, you're right. I mean, if we come back to talk about impacts of the pandemic, it's precisely right. There is some job and task redesign. My neighbor, actually, if I turn my camera around, I can see her house. So I live on Stanford campus, and Terry, my neighbor, she lives across the road. She's a doctor, and she was telling me that, of course, as soon as before pandemic, I remember talking to her. She said that PANTH, our local health clinic, part of Sutter Health, was trying to move people to online telehealth, but the big barrier was billing. That people could come in for things that, like collecting a test result and it's negative, you just want to know the result. But if they did it online, you couldn't bill people. Whereas suddenly that restriction got changed under the pandemic. You can now bill people for telehealth properly. All insurers will pay for it. And you can also do it cross-state border. So it used to be if someone happened to be in Arizona, that was a real problem for her, but because she wasn't licensed. Anyway, all of that's gone. So now telehealth is, that's going to be, for that group, I mean, it's a small share of our population. But
that's why, because of all these technological changes we implemented to be able to work from home. I mean, we are using Zoom that we've never used before, like this extensively. I'm a bit surprised that there is the expectation that only about 20%, I mean, do you think this is a big number or a small number? I would have expected a much larger number, actually.
I actually think it's the efficient number. So it's a huge, just to give you trends, before the pandemic, working from home was already rising. It was roughly doubling every 12 years. So it would have taken 25 years of natural growth if you extrapolate. And that's a pretty heroic extrapolation, but who knows? So on current trends, so I see that as a very large increase from 5 to 20%. But then the question is, why has it dropped back? Weirdly under this pandemic, it's the first time ever I felt like research has been totally connected to kind of managers. So I spend so much time, probably talk to a couple, 1 or 2 managers a day right now. Some of it can mostly just, like weird discussion, people can't reach out. But the big trade-off for firms, for folks like us, post-pandemic is it's more efficient, it seems to be, in terms of innovation and creativity, to be face-to-face. But it's more efficient for doing individual tasks on your own to be at home.
Not
you
be
also save the
interrupted.
commute.
Wait a second, and also there is the issue of rent, right? They have gotten rid of some office space, they have not been paying rent. So I can imagine places like New York, San Francisco, this is like a big cost to get back to. Or is that not important to them?
No, it is. So so this is a complicated, so there are kind of three levels here. So one question is, what's the efficient days to be working in the office? So the normal view is that I'd say 80% of firms I've talked to, and it comes out in our survey, is they're going to do something like 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week at home post-pandemic. The reason is you can just apply like the task-based model, the Auto-Levy-Murnane, say, task-based model, and think about breaking out what we do throughout the day into tasks. So we have meetings, we have group events, things that we've got to do with other people, and then we have stuff that we do individually on our own, like, you know, writing emails, reading reports, for example. And the group events, we just relocate in the week. So we do them all, say, on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and the whole team and everyone comes in on those days. There's no loss. We're all face-to-face. The individual event, the individual tasks like reading reports or doing, you know,
yeah,
paperwork.
you're rather not interrupted by other people. You're more efficient doing it at home. Yes.
Exactly right. And you do that Wednesday, Friday, and you just don't go into the office. So that's like the best of both worlds. You know, you're more productive because you're on your home days, and you lose no productivity in your work days because you're there as ever before. So, I could stop sharing it. So I didn't realize I'm sharing. So that would increase productivity. So that's the reason why most people think they're going to do 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week at home. Post-pandemic, then you raised another issue about office space. That gets more complicated.
Exactly.
So, you know, this is like another long literature in economics between decentralization and centralization. You know, going back to Hayek and command, there's a complete trade-off, and firms have different views on this. So one view is let's let each team make its decision. So you, Marina, you have your team, and you go reach out to every member of your team, and you say, we all need to come in on the same days because that's much more efficient. But what days do we want to come in on? And I think we probably want to come in on 3, but does anyone want to push for 4 versus 2? And you have a discussion, and your team decides, hey, look, let's all come in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We're going to take Monday, Friday, and work at home. Fine. So that's one view. That's great. The problem is you can't really save much office space that way.
Exactly.
So,
you pay the same. Plus, if you need to cross-team work, then that doesn't work either. It's like a mess.
Exactly right. So that's one view, and it depends on how much decentralization and flexibility and preferences matter. The alternative is you do it from the center. It's a bit like a teaching matrix. You go back and forth. The center makes the plan. It pushes it down to the managers, checks with them whether they're okay. They totally violently disagree. It goes up and down. But that way, you then have a uniform distribution across days that people work from home, and then you can shrink office space a bit. But that does require some centralization. So firms differ on that. And it depends, honestly, how much they care about choice and flexibility versus how expensive their office space is and how much people need to be in across teams.
But you wouldn't see then some firms moving totally working from home and some firms moving totally. So you think that most likely some form of hybrid with an unknown distribution of responsibilities and decision-making power?
Yeah. So the evidence is, there's 2 sources of evidence that are really useful. One is Zillow data, which is property transaction data we're looking at, and the other is US Postal Service change of address data. And in both cases, what we see is pretty clear evidence. In fact, I can screen share again. I got the Zillow stuff here. So if we go down, here we go. So this is the Zillow data. If you look here, looks at, and the top is purchase prices from the Zillow Home Value Index, and then the lower one is rental prices.
This is firm space or housing space?
This is households.
Okay.
So this is on households, and I'll talk to you a bit about firms in a minute, because for Zillow, I have the household data is much better because the commercial property market is kind of in stasis. It's in a kind of deep slumber. Not surprising, no one is signing or buying much commercial properties. The transaction volume is so down that you can't really do much with it, but you can on the residential. So what you see is maybe not surprising to anyone is what we call the donut effect, which is the center of large US cities. We have the 12 largest ones here. You can imagine San Francisco, New York, Chicago, etc. The central business districts are doing really badly because no one wants to live there. It's not just rental, they're doing really badly in purchase prices, whereas the outer suburbs are doing really well. And this is like economics 101. If you only got to commute into the office 3 days a week, you are less bothered about a long commute. You also want more space at home. So collectively, that pushes you up.
Especially in a pandemic where you can't go out and you're probably very crowded and none of the city amenities can be used.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I think the rental response is much larger. But you notice the purchase response is quite big. I mean, if you look at over 1 year, the price gap that's opened up is almost 10%. That's a pretty big difference. Whereas these guys you can see beforehand were basically tracking each other. This is within the same city. By the way, if you look at
permanent relocation for individuals. So basically, in workers fled cities, moved to the suburbs. Now it's not going to be that easy to move them back, I guess.
No, I think it's permanent. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's probably quite good, honestly. So to be clear, they're not moving across cities. So there's two very different pieces of analysis. One is within each city, which is what this is doing. And we're only looking at the 12 largest cities. The second is, are they moving from New York to, say, Topeka, Kansas? And the answer is no, on average, they're not. So if you do a graph, I haven't included it here, but you do a graph of the change in price, city by city, against the baseline price, it's totally flat. So it's not that cheap cities like Topeka are going up and expensive cities like New York are going down. There's no correlation. It's within basically large cities, people are moving out. The other data I haven't shown you here, we just got actually literally this week, was the US Postal Service change of address data, which is fascinating. And it has both households and businesses, and it has both temporary and permanent. Because people
wow, that's amazing.
You can either say, Marina, I temporarily want to forward my mail because I'm going to go live in, Hawaii for a year, or you can permanently move. What you see in that on the household is the same as this. There's a huge flow of people permanently and temporarily relocating their mail out if they live in city center zip codes. But we also see the same for businesses. The thing that's a bit more striking is a large number of businesses have permanently moved their address out of city centers. So I think exactly as you say, city centers are going down in price. It may unwind 10, 20 years of city growth. So again, I'm not sure it's bad, just as the backdrop is city centers have become relatively more expensive.
Or reallocation, now we're in a transition where some firms just change the technology and moving to the suburbs, and then you give rise to other types of businesses that arise in city centers. But,
totally.
Yeah.
So this again is, when you talk to journalists, they often say, does that mean that city centers will be deserted? It's like, no, it just means the rents and the valuations will go down. So of course, if the rents and the prices of real estate in city centers goes down by a third, different people move in, and everyone on average has slightly larger apartments. So density is a bit down, but it's not zero. I mean, there might be a few artists and, artisans in New York in the way there were in probably 1990 and 2000, and now it's too expensive.
Unless companies want to go back eventually. So I guess we round back to the question of it will depend on whether workers are being recalled or not after the pandemic.
Yeah, so then the paper I wrote with Jose and Steve Davis is called Why Working From Home Will Stick, and it comes back to that original 20% number. And your question, why doesn't it go back to 5% pre-pandemic? And, I can give you there's like 5 factors that we put in the paper. I'm trying to remember if I can even remember all of them, but one is stigma. So firms, there's reports of way less negative stigma about working from home. That shirking from home thing is gone. The second is efficiency. So firms report that it's turning out to be far more efficient working from home than they expected. There's also what's called the two-arm bandit problem, that a lot of firms have experimented, and some on the tail find it's great and will stick. The third is innovation. So there's been huge amounts of pro-working from home innovation. So if you look at in the US Patent Office, so another project of Yulius Escova, you see that the number of patents that mention working from home is like exploded in the pandemic.
So making it easier and more efficient, yes.
Exactly, it will get better and better. The fourth is co-investment. So we estimate from the survey, something like 1% of GDP has been invested by households on equipment and time to get working from up and running at home. Like, I bought a proper mic.
Me too, I have the system now, which I didn't have before.
And I have this, my desk can go up or down. I mean, I'm not, it's going to be a bit weird, but I would never have done that. There'd be no point. But so there's a lot of, and then finally, the final one is kind of most interesting. Come back to your comment earlier about, we ask people, the final one I call fear of proximity. So I ask people post-pandemic, after you have a vaccine, what activities you go back to, and there's a list of them, and it goes from kind of more and more proximity. Over 75% of people report, at least now, they will not go back to getting on crowded subway trains and in elevators. And, you know, is that true? It's hard to tell. After 9/11, there was a big permanent drop in air travel. It took 3 years to get back to the previous trend. I think there'll be a lot of people who are going to be very nervous. You know, you saw a few days ago, the CDC reported you can still get infected with the vaccine.
I know. It's a very small percentage, but
I totally agree.
So look, enough.
You know, we had flu already before. I say, look, my own personal view is when we're vaccinated, you know, we can go out and return to normal. But that's
actually the fear factor is important. So when you look, for example, at the Google data on mobility, so we were working with this with Alessandra Folli, Fabrizio Perri, and Mark Ponder, and we were looking at the Google data in New York at the beginning of the pandemic, and you see that the day they announced that maybe they closed school, people stopped going shopping. And it was way before they actually imposed the constraints of 75 of people must remain home. So people just got scared and stopped doing a lot of activities that they thought would be risky. So there is a sense in which if it takes too long to make sure this is not going to go away, maybe people are going to be scared of doing some activities or working next to a coworker.
No, you're completely right. I mean, that's what the surveys suggest, and you know, everyone has their own views on this.
So what do you think? What do you think this is going to imply for the education sector? Because we used to be, you know, in very crowded classrooms. Then we moved to online. With it worked better or worse in different places. Do you think we'll go back to classrooms? Do you think we'll go back to having a hybrid teaching system?
Probably. I mean, you had the same experience. My own preference is for Stanford, they mandate everyone gets vaccinated, then we just go back to before. We exactly as before without masks. So personally, I've taught on Zoom. It was okay. I'd say it's 5 or 6 out of 10. If 10 out of 10 is in person, it wasn't terrible. It wasn't a disaster. You know, I felt like one of these firms. It wasn't the disaster I feared it would be, but it was clearly less good than in person. So, and I think once we're vaccinated, the risk from, I mean, COVID, I think is very low, and there's huge costs for not meeting in person. So I just don't think the cost benefit, but I don't know. I don't know what the university's plan. I mean, as far as I know, a lot of discussion is we'll go back in the fall, but wearing masks. I suspect that won't work very well because it's harder to communicate. If you wear glasses like me, they fog up. So I probably would rather go to a Zoom seminar than go in person in one in masks. And I suspect a lot of people will have the same view. So then we'll have what's called mixed mode, which is just horrible. So that won't work, you know.
That
mixed
doesn't
mode
work very well.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
On the other hand, it also depends on your student body, because if some low-income students don't need to pay housing, they might want the option of doing things online. I mean, you may be open to open education to a much wider audience.
That's completely correct. So I was, you know, for Stanford, where it's a residential university experience and you're paying that.
Exactly.
But you're completely correct that much like with firms, there'll be a huge amount of innovation. And so there's a lot of schools, for example, that are now going to be Zoom schools only. And that's good. I mean, look, if you're out in the countryside, or imagine you're working overseas in a multinational or in an area where the local schools are really poor, It may well be better to have Zoom school. I totally agree. Or you can have supplementary schooling, and the same with the university. So I'm completely on board with that. So I think, much like with businesses, we see it go from 5 to 20% of people working from home. I wouldn't be surprised with education. It goes from 1% to 8% of, you know, school days at home. I think there's still the majority be in the classroom. Another big issue that's come up is this is a hugely complementary with good performance management. So oddly enough, I actually interviewed Marissa Mayer, who was the CEO of Yahoo. She ran it in 2013 when they banned working from home. And it's this huge media.
I remember.
Story.
Yeah, it was a big news then.
Yeah, exactly right. So that I went back and interviewed her about 6-9 months ago. I reached out to her, and you know, she eventually agreed to talk to me. Her story about what happened in Yahoo in 2013 was fascinating. Again, it was like personal economics, you know, in reference in some parts of, you know, Eddie Luzier, who sadly just passed away. But the story was, look, you can monitor people on inputs. So you can, in the office, like, are you, Marina, sitting in your chair, typing away furiously, appear to be working hard? Or are you kind of goofing off and snoring? Or you can monitor people on outputs, which is, are you producing what you're supposed to be doing?
Exactly.
If you input monitor, which is basically deemed bad management, everything I've done, then it's horrible working from home because you can't see them. And firms that do that have adopted this kind of nasty surveillance software. It takes screenshots.
Yeah, where you have to log in and they check how many hours you're in, and it's like they're going back to the cards.
Yeah, exactly. So input monitoring is awful, whereas output monitoring works really well from working from home. You just say, sure, go home, do whatever you want. As long as you continue to perform, you're fine. So there's a huge complementarity, and not surprisingly, you see in data already coming out that if you look at firms by their performance management scores, beforehand, better firms obviously doing a bit better already, but the pandemic and the thing totally bifurcates. So if you have good performance management, it's not really been a problem. If you have bad performance management, it's been horrible. And so there's a strong complementarity, and I'm sure HR consultants are going to do very well in the next 2 years putting this stuff in place. And that was Marissa Mayer's story. She said when she took over at ER in 2013, they had bad performance management because they had problems with the CEOs. She'd come in, put in this aggressive system. When it was up and running, she then allowed people to return to working from home, but like 2-3 days a week. So totally it was like a perfect example of what's happening now. It's like I completely agree. That's exactly what firms are doing now. And what she did in 2013 was recall people that were 5 days a week at home who had no performance management. And she said the reason she did it, she looked at their login data, and there are people that hadn't logged in for like 9 or 10 days. They're full-time employees. They have not turned on their computer for 9. You're like, what are they doing? It's not like they're not doing much work. They're literally doing none.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Let's see. But I think it's going to be, it's a fantastic avenue of research. I mean, I think this is going to be, it's a big experiment that we are doing. I mean, we are changing as we go.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to say is, one of the very few upsides of the pandemic will be the big increase in working from home post-pandemic. I think it's going to be a welfare improving. In our surveys, employees report they value it the same as about an 8% pay increase, which in fact, amazingly, is almost identical to the number that Alex Mass and Mandy Pillay came out in the AAR paper in 2017. They did an RCT on, I won't go through the details.
But did you estimate, do you have a good way to estimate change in productivity, or is it perceived?
Oh, okay. This is valuation. So there's two very different.
Oh,
so this is
company valuation. Yeah.
No, you're correct. You're totally right. So on the valuation, we ask people. Again, this is what they tell us. This is why the Mass and Palais is nice because it's actual choice data. But we asked them post-pandemic, if you're allowed to work from home 2 days a week, do you think it's good? You like it, neutral, don't like it. And if they say positive or negative, we say how much and give them a whole bunch of numbers.
I see.
For equivalent salary, and the average is plus 8%. Which makes about sense. On productivity, we also ask them that is roughly zero, is very mildly positive. The big issue is on short versus long. So I think short run, like doing the same thing we've ever done, works fine. We just keep going with tasks. Kids are. I get kids.
I was going to ask. We'll go back to that in a second.
But kids is a huge issue. But we're asking them about post-COVID. The kids thing is why I have stuff like this lying next to my desk. My room is full of my youngest keeps coming. It's very sweet. But yeah, kids is a big issue. I totally get that. Post-pandemic, though, most people view when kids are back at school, productivity on the current tasks is probably up at home because you can focus and you save on commute. Just to be clear, commute. If you work 8 hours a day and commute 1 hour a day, if you're no longer commuting, you've gained over.
You get that 1 hour, and you're not tired, and you're going to be
huge. And also other things like in the C-Trip study where we were recording people's data phone calls by minute, other things that maybe seem not a big deal, but like going to the toilet, getting lunch, chatting to people, those things add up to quite a lot of time delays. So
you're very efficient eating and you're at your desk at home.
It's horrible, but you're. So actually, people are more productive on their current activities working from home. The problem is, it seems to be, and this research on this is not as. There's no RC. I agree with it, but it's more of an open question. It's a good area to do, but the research on creativity and innovation suggests it's not as good if you're at home, and that would be my prime.
So we didn't discuss it before, but how about males versus females? Do you have any sense?
So it's very okay. I'd say 3 points. One is by far the largest divide on anything we see in the data is by education. So I'll talk about gender. but education just trumps anything. If you want to look at an R squared, say on do you work from home or do you like working from home? Is it productive? Education has like 10x anything else. So, and the reason is, coming back to what we talked about earlier, is it totally predicts what task you do. So if you're a grad, you're like to be working on a computer, you can do it remotely. If you left school at 16, you're probably doing something physical and you can't. So then on gender, most of the gender stuff is surprisingly relatively insignificant. And we keep looking at this. There's one angle I'll show in a minute that is significant, but mostly it's relatively insignificant. It's not to say it's zero, but the magnitudes, we thought that, for example, women or women and kids may report more negative experiences. They don't massively. I don't know why. I mean, I'd say what we find in the data. The one area where there is a significant difference, I'll screen share, and that is worrying, and it relates to a lot of advice I've been giving to companies, is this. Okay, I'll show you 2 slides. Let's go. So here we go. We asked people, so similarly and across data, we asked people how many days a week would you like to work post-COVID. You notice that it's almost it's kind of like a uniform density. It's about as maximum variation as you could get. If I showed you that support, how could you maximize the variation in opinion? This looks a lot like it. So 30% of people want to work from home forever. Don't want to stop post-pandemic, and 20% like, never again. I cannot spend a single more day working in my toilet. So that's the first thing, is a big spread. And this is kind of causing friction a bit. The thing that's more striking on gender is if you look at post-COVID, you break it down by gender. If you look at graduates, which is about 2/3 of our response thing, so people with 1+ year, people with 1+ year of college and people with children under the age of 12, there is quite a big difference in gender between the choice to work from home 5 days a week. So you can see women have almost 50% higher preference than men. So the reason this is a big issue is if firms let people choose which days they work from home. And as we know from a lot of the research data, if you're in a team where you work from home 4 days a week. So in C-TRIP, when we randomized it, I did this RCT a few years ago that was published in the QJE. We found that people that work from home 4 days a week had almost half the promotion rate of people that are in the office 5 days a week.
So the gender gap is going to blow up here.
If you let people choose. So this is the, I'd say by far the biggest debate in the corporate world that companies have a view on, is the trade-off between these 2 slides. Choice. So this slide says let people choose. Some people, are desperate to come back to work. Why not let them? Other people loathe it and let them work from home 5 days a week. So initially you think we should totally do it. There's a lot of welfare money left on the table if we force everyone in for 2 days a week. Some people really have very different views. The problem is it collides into this, that if you do that, you discover that it's not just women with young kids, it's also going to be disabled people, people living far from the office. There'll be a whole bunch of demographics that are going to be associated with working from home 4 or 5 days a week. That group is not going to get promoted at nearly the rate. 5-10 years from now, we're going to have, a diversity crisis. So my advice, actually, I'll stop sharing. My advice has been not to let people choose. And it seems very authoritarian, but because I'm more concerned
in the long run, it's going to give more equitable outcomes.
Yes. And even for firms, just from managers' perspective, one is they lose diversity, which is a cost. And 2, they're going to face a whole slew of lawsuits, appropriately. I mean, if you look at the data, you're going to find, you can predict exactly what will be in the data. So I keep suggesting, look, go for 3 days a week and force everyone to do that. There are some people that want 5, there are some that want 0. Don't let them choose, because you can imagine it'll be all single young men in the office, women with young kids. You can know what's going to happen. It's quite kind of predictable from the data.
So for someone that is thinking about trying to study this, what would be your suggestions of avenue of research, or what are interesting ideas that you thought would be worth exploring by some, young assistant professor, grad student that is interested in this working from home revolution?
It's a fantastic topic because it just hits everything. And also you have a really nice exogenous, often when you go to applied micro seminars, is the thing exogenous? Does the exclusion restriction hold? On the first, yes.
And this is an MIT shock by definition, yes.
Yes, it's like totally unpredicted, exactly right. It's a perfect MIT shock. The problem, and so in that sense is ideal. And so if it were me, I'd try and just get variation to look at, high versus low income, or good or bad broadband, or, there's so many domains. I mean, people have so many great ideas and it's already stuff flooding out. The only thing just to be aware of, I guess, would be what else changed at the same time. So what makes it slightly tricky is there's fear of infection and, customer. So one of the things you notice is firms that have employees working from home have done a lot better. So there's a paper by, I'm trying to remember all the co-authors, Dimitris Papanicolaou is one of them. I can't remember who the others were, but I'm embarrassed. There's somebody, I'm misrepresenting their paper, but if I remember right, they looked at firms by the type of occupations they had and whether people can work from home. And those that can work from home did a lot better in the pandemic relatively in the stock market. One story is it's easier for employees to work from home. Of course, the other story is if you're in a firm where you can work from home, it's probably like your services or goods can also be provided remotely.
Exactly.
So
if you're a dentist, there's not much you can do.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the exclusion restriction problem. So I think working from home, much like there's going to be a massive amount of papers there were on financial frictions. I know your stuff on partisan fighting after Trump as well. These events generate lots of interest and lots of variation. I would start with just, one angle is occupations. It turns out working from home is highly correlated to occupation and education. That gives a nice angle to vary things over and then really go from there.
Okay. Thanks for being with us and for all the insights, and let's see what happens. I mean, we'll learn pretty soon in the fall if we are back to normal or not.
Exactly right. Hey, thanks very much, Marina. Love to catch up again.
Bye-bye.